So I was catching up with my uncle recently, and we were talking about how grateful we are for life, love, and Ethereum. And then he started to tell me what it was like to grow up in Compton during the 70s. He said it was like a black utopia, like Atlanta in the 90s, except replace Freaknik with block parties. Okay, that's the same thing. Replace pussy popping with water balloon fights. Basically, the first episode of Snowfall is what Compton was like. You should watch it, it's a great show. Anyway, around 1985, during the Reagan era, crack mysteriously showed up like a relative in need of a loan, and everything changed. So I did a little homework because I wanted to understand my hometown of Compton on a deeper level, which led me to a question I feel like nobody asked, which is, who really started gangs in Compton? Was it Bloods, Crips, LAPD? It was neither. It was actually suburban white people. Let that marinate. Suburban white people started gangs in Compton. Here's why. In the 1940s, Compton was an all-white suburb, and after World War II, Los Angeles had an industrial boom of jobs. Enter African Americans looking to escape the South in Jim Crow. Suburban whites were like, hell no, to the no, 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 hell to the no. So the all-white community, the city council, and the FHA conspired to, quote, keep Compton white. They did several things to try to accomplish this goal, like creating restrictive covenants, aka rules, preventing real estate agents from selling to African Americans or else they'll get their real estate license revoked. Banks would just flat out deny black and brown people home loans. Yo, have y'all been watching The Winter Soldier? Did you see that the Falcon couldn't even get a loan? The dude fought Thanos and couldn't get a loan. If I were him, I would have read that Hydra chant to the Winter Soldier and had him take that loan officer the out. Anyway, back to Compton. In 1948, the court's decision of Shelley versus Kramer declared that racially charged restrictive covenants are unenforceable by the state, which essentially meant that all-white Compton could legally still intimidate and terrorize black people, but the state couldn't help them do it anymore. Now, in 1952, Compton began to see its first black homeowners, and the suburban whites were like, so they did what most hateful races do best and turned to a more sinister form of intimidation to scare off African Americans. They formed mobs and Compton's first gang called the Spook Hunters. Their sole purpose was to terrorize blacks and keep them away from their turf. These mobs and spook hunters would do things like set lawns on fire, bomb people's homes, and drive-by shootings. You know, gang shit. Gang. While more blacks and Latinos moved into the city, whites were moving to the outskirts of the city, but that didn't stop them from terrorizing minorities. Eventually, the blacks and Latinos got so tired of the way that they were being treated that they started to form their own gangs to protect themselves against this harassment. Now, by 1969, this treatment was so far out of control that it inspired two high school kids named Raymond Washington and Tookie Williams to found the Community Resource for Independent People, aka the Crips, to protect black citizens from police harassment. Let that marinate. Two high school kids wanted to protect people in their community from police harassment and formed the Crips. They modeled it after the Black Panthers, you know, the men and women who would educate, organize, and protect black people from police harassment in the Bay Area. They also fed poor kids breakfast on the weekends, you know, those guys that were obliterated by the FBI. Now, how did the Crips go from a community resource organization to the notorious gang that the media portrays today? Around the late 70s and 80s, the fear of an African American being unified by another Malcolm X, Fred Hampton, or Huey Newton was so high that the white establishment pulled out the big guns to keep blacks down. It started real subtle with informants infiltrating gangs to provoke confrontation amongst members, or leaders would just flat out get murdered by police. Any resistance was literally harassed, imprisoned, or murdered out of the community, and gangs were pretty much the only thing that survived. And on an economic level, the white establishment removed all social provisions or monetary assistance meant to help low-income families during that time. Thousands of black kids were being arrested, fingerprinted, and charged with bogus crimes, giving them records that made it virtually impossible for them to get jobs during a time where jobs were already decreasing. So you put the father in prison, you drive the mom crazy, and let her raise a bunch of kids on her own, and the kids grow up without any positive influences to turn to. So gangs became their only salvation because during that time, it was their only salvation. Then crack mysteriously came out of nowhere and got sprinkled over the whole situation with a little bit of oregano, and voila, what do you have? A recipe for disaster.
Trauma.
One of my favorite movies is The Dark Knight Rises. That movie taught me that the worst prisons are the ones that give you hope. So what did the white establishment create to give black people hope during this time? They created the perfect lie, aka the black middle class. The black middle class was purposefully created to give black people the impression that you can make it too. As long as you obey the rules, keep your head down, your nose clean, and you be a good little black person, you can be successful too. So now, take a person without a job, influence them with rampant materialism of the dominant culture, sit back and watch them turn to criminal activity. In the late 80s, crime and crack became the only means for survival for most people. Addiction and crime reached record highs, and the once utopian Compton was obliterated, leaving scars of crime, gang violence, and addiction in its wake. So now, the next time you and your black friends are out somewhere having a good time, and an older white person looks at you and says you're a thug, you little gang member, or something similar to that, look them dead in the eyes and say, "Bitch, I learned it from you."
Boy, you crazy fool, you!
Man at the Chamber of Commerce said that really the whites were to blame for the way Compton is now. They called that a white flight, that when the open housing came in and the blacks started moving into a community, the whites panicked and left. How do you feel about all that?
Well, I think they're a bunch of cowards myself. There was nothing to be afraid of here any more than there would be any place else.